Thousands of inspirational stories in the ArkLaMiss, and Aaron Dietrich always seems to find them. Tonight, the Louisiana Reporter of the Year and two-time Regional Edward R. Murrow Award winner shares another heartwarming story in this edition of What's Your Story?
When ULM travels to Auburn this weekend, the Warhawks traveling party will feature a special family with a unique story. Saturday's showdown will feature hugs, tears, and one powerful message.
You know, this is what I always wanted to do, want to see. And
The Perrys taking a family outing to Malone Stadium.
you know, something I think about every day. You know, obviously that was going to be my football buddy.
9 years ago, Jonathan and Holly's lives changed forever.
We talk about him a lot, just because we don't ever want his memory to die.
What y'all doing?
Always smiling, always happy. He was just perfect.
At an early age, John Clark was destined to be a star.
I always prayed for a son. He was my baby boy, loved him to death.
At 6 months old, John Clark was rushed to St. Francis.
We walked in that hospital, you know, thinking he had a bug. And, you know, within a few hours, we knew it was something serious, and we walked out of there, you know, without our son.
Can't put a price on John Clark. Can't put a price on our family.
As the Perrys grieved in Monroe, Davis Boswell in Auburn, Alabama was fighting for his life on the heart donor waiting list for 115 days.
Immediately when we found out that he would need a heart transplant to survive, you know, we were praying for the donor family, not even knowing who they were.
There's always good. You can find some good in all bad. And we've definitely found it with John Clark.
You're in a situation where you realize that another child has to die in order for your child to live. I'm sorry, it still gets to me every time.
John Clark's heart was a perfect match. Davis was given a second chance at life. Now one heart connecting two families.
Man, I saw a picture the other day of Davis holding a picture of John Clark, just super happy.
In the last 8.5 years, the Perrys and Boswells have spent time together at ball games and at the beach. But there's a first encounter that will never be forgotten.
Getting chills whenever you talk about that.
John Clark's twin sister Ella reconnecting and forming a special relationship with Davis.
Not everybody gets a noggin. I think that's a God wink. You know, that for us is like giving a kiss. You know, it's an affection thing we do in our family.
Come here, boy. Ah!
Hi, have you hit a home run yet?
God is still writing this story.
Fate, faith, and one heart continue to bring two families together.
It's crazy how the Lord worked everything out, you know, took a really tragic situation and made beauty from it, really.
I started crying and I was like, are you...
Heartache can also be found in the Vincent's household, as Holly lost her niece 7 years ago.
Yes, our Anna had a liver transplant and unfortunately passed away right after. But we learned a lot about organ donation and the importance of it.
To honor John Clark and to celebrate Davis, LSU and Auburn had hosted an organ donation awareness game since 2016. With the SEC rivals not squaring off this season, Bryant Vincent's Warhawks are more than willing to step up to the plate.
Being able to use our platform to help others and to help families and to raise awareness is part of the plan.
I think with football we always say power's in the people, and that's true.
The loss is hard, but to be able to have a positive of, you know, helping somebody out and let my son become a hero.
The John Clark Perry Foundation continues to make an impact in Northeast Louisiana. They have provided financial support to over 100 families with children in need of life-changing medical treatments. If you'd like to donate or find out more information, go to the foundation's website. That is the Perry story. What is yours? I'd love to tell it. Just email me at aaron.dietrich@knoe.com.